First, thanks to Elliot and Robin and the Destination DC team. I'm excited to be here. I've spent a lot of time in Washington, DC as a kid and as an adult. I'm privileged to be here with everybody. And just a note about it, sort of in this COVID environment, that I'm in a suit, even a waistcoat and a tie. I want you to know that was very intentional because first, Elliot's the best dressed executive in the travel industry, and I feel always inadequate in that way. And because Jan and the mayor are part of this meeting today, I thought it was really important I represent in the right way. But thanks to everybody for having me. I really appreciate it. Let's talk about what's changing in travel. There's probably a lot I don't need to tell you. Everybody's feeling this. But what's going on? How should we be thinking about this with guests and travelers? Where do we think it's going from here? That's really what I want to address today. And let's start with what's going on. Obviously, the way in which this has changed around the world, infection rates coming up, coming down, border controls, advice by government, the way in which trade is working, has all really morphed a lot in the last 5 months. And I'll get into that a little bit. But the unpredictability of COVID and the then lack of confidence for public officials, private companies, individuals, has really been the game changer as we look at the data. I don't know if you know this, but coronavirus is actually the second most used word in the English language online since April. The word people's only been used more. So that obviously gives you a sense of how we have been focused on this virus in very intense ways. And in the US alone, 60 million people have either been directly or indirectly affected from a health standpoint when it comes to coronavirus, which perpetuates a lot of what we see in the market in terms of fear and uncertainty. And I don't need to tell the people in this meeting about what has been damaging to our industry. This has obviously been very, very hard for restaurant owners, for hotel companies, for individuals in the travel industry. We worry the most about the airline industry and that it's now over $200 billion in losses because that will affect route maps. It will affect load and lift decisions, and that then drives a lot around travel recovery. Just as the stimulus has waned, many markets are now not being served by the main carriers, and that has a carry-on effect for everybody in the travel industry. But obviously, this has been very difficult for everybody. And I think it's interesting to look just year on year at visits to businesses in the United States, down 20% as of mid-August. And this is, to give you a sense of that, that's on reduced capacity. In Europe, 91% of attractions have now reopened. In Asia, it's over 70%. But in the US, only 52% of attractions have reopened. So not only are there fewer visits for business owners, but there's less capacity available to travelers. And that combines in this effect that's really challenging. We also know that over 50% in our July survey told us they're fearful of getting coronavirus, and that level of fear is driving a lot of their decision making. So let's talk a little bit about the travel industry itself. Let's start with group. We know that group, especially corporate group, international long-haul group, has really suffered. And in fact, we believe that group will recover in some very specific ways. It will start with SMERF, an unmanaged group business, and it will then move into association, eventually some corporate business, and then convention, citywide type business, international long haul. But that's the challenge, and we do see some positive signs that I'll come back to. On the leisure side, I think everybody understands that this is starting as a leisure drive recovery. It is, that's where it is today. There's been some air demand. It began to grow in June, but has recessed. But we know that this is also going to build over time. The short haul drive will eventually move further and further out. People are going on average 395 miles right now for a leisure trip, and we expect that will expand when air becomes more in a demand. I mentioned the fear phase we're in. We think there are 4 important phases as we've looked at past health and other types of crises. People are in fear. They then move to understanding, they move to action and rational behavior. And interestingly, based on our data, we were emerging from the fear phase in June. And then the narrative switched and we're back into the fear phase again. And that's really the challenge for travel at the moment. And if you look at how people think about that, sort of 3 things. First, they don't trust anybody else to follow the proper safety protocols. They trust themselves, but nobody else. Because of that, they're moving to more familiar things. They will travel with friends and family before they'll travel with anybody else. They will, in fact, go back to brands they know and to destinations they know because they want to feel control, mostly in their car. And then lastly, we know that relative to meetings and the way we're doing business, people really are less likely to lean into those things. And we know that people are comfortable being at home for work. We also know that they are much more likely to do things for themselves on the leisure side than they are to travel for business. And we can all decide for ourselves what that really means, but that's what we're seeing in the data. So let's talk about what travel recovery looks like. Just to give you some sense of the landscape, this is looking back from 2007 on travel intent. And you can see coming out of the 08-09 recession, this also actually includes swine flu data when we were in the midst of swine flu in 08-09. You can see we saw a steady rise of intent to travel, reaching a peak in late 17, but now a steady decline since coronavirus at historical lows. The 91 level represents the lowest level since the weeks after 9/11. So we know even though we're seeing some demand, there's still low intent, or at least people are telling us they have low intent. There's some green shoots there, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But this is tied specifically to people's belief in how this crisis comes to an end. By far, people believe a vaccine is necessary before they can feel comfortable to travel. There are other factors here, herd mentality, the virus wanes. But by and large, over 40% of people say that I will not feel comfortable full-on traveling until we have a vaccine in the marketplace. And then you look at the economic damage. So this is from Oxford Economics, and you look at how it's really, really bad in April and May, and then it slowly improves as we get beyond out months in this year. I also think it's interesting to look at other parts of the world. China was 60 days ahead of the US in terms of when the infection started and how they handled it. This is a relatively old data chart because it only runs through May, but you can see what recovery started to look like. A steady demand for room nights, actually, but then as a result, we saw something very interesting in China, and that was the demand was higher midweek than it was on the weekends, which is exactly the opposite of what's happening in the US. We actually see demand spiking on the weekends for leisure travel and midweek being very problematic. In China, it's actually been the reverse. Okay, a couple things. Let's start with our team's insight that we believe travel will recover faster than many in our comp set or in the industry are saying. We see this in data from past crises, and we think that that's going to probably play out in a similar way. I'll give you an example. And I don't want to compare coronavirus or COVID-19 to anything we've seen in the past, but this is data around SARS. Those of you who remember, we were in a tougher economic period in 2003, and then SARS hit. It hit hard in Canada and in Asia. It had carry-on effects in Europe and the US. But what's interesting about this chart is although people stopped traveling, both domestically and internationally, once things were all clear, the media narrative changed and it was clear that the virus was under control, the pivot by travelers was immediate and both on the leisure side and the commercial side. And we think we can see behaviors for that coming out of coronavirus as well. And this is to give you an idea. As I said earlier, in June, we started to see recovery. And then the narrative switched around infections again. So people were telling us both commercially and leisure, on the leisure side, that they wanted to travel, and now that's tipped down again. But it tells you what I think this slide supports. Though 1/3 of people say they're postponing their plans and a pretty good number say they're going to cancel their trips, out over time, they actually change their mind. So people will say that they're canceling, but they'll change their mind very soon after that. And we expect that behavior to be similar in this case. Here's some data from Deutsche Bank that supports that. This is a wide range of things that people said in this survey that they would or would not do over months. But what's interesting to me about this chart is if you look at the large percentage of people who were unsure or who didn't know how they would respond over time. And I think that's instructive in that people wait and see. And though they may say one thing now, they change their mind or don't know and act in a very different way down the road. And that's validated by our social sentiment. We track a lot of metrics around social sentiment and what people are saying online. And you can see here, people are talking a lot about travel, and that the amount of travel talk is growing online, which is a real positive sign. I also want to take a minute just on a soapbox to talk about this notion that travel creates so many more things than just conversation. It creates emotional intelligence. And this is this idea that Zoom will ever replace the need for meetings or corporate travel or corporate business making. That when we travel for leisure, we are trying to connect with things. Empathy. We're trying to connect with an energy that can only be created in person. And I would say that about business as well. And my belief is that we all crave emotional intelligence around travel. And for that reason, we will want to travel more readily. We also like to look at the airlines as a bellwether. As I said, in June, we began to see really nice pickup in air travel. If you looked at the ultra-low and low-cost carriers like Frontier, Spirit, and Southwest, they were seeing really nice load factors. granted on reduced capacity, but in the 70s in some cases for travel. That tipped back down when we saw a resurgence of the virus. But even today, Southwest is out in very aggressive ways talking about fall travel, providing fair deals to get people going again, and then communicating this notion of safety around air travel, which I'll come back to. But this is the underpinning for what we want to talk about relative to people's mindset, and that is, what is it that will tip them over to traveling in the full way again? And if you look at this chart, you can see there are a lot of things out of the control of we as travel marketers. What CDC says, what border controls look like, who's open and who's not. But if you look down this chart, you can see there are many things we can control. How we communicate safety, how invested we are with our brand in the marketplace, what kind of fare inducements or rate inducements we provide to get people traveling again. And we believe that because, as I said earlier with the Deutsche Bank data, that a lot of people are waiting to see what happens. They're going to be very susceptible to inducements to get them going again. And we know that the summer has been a lost season in many respects. As I said, it began to build in June and then has really subsided for July and August travel. We think that's going to extend into what we're calling the stretch season. We actually think a lot of that demand that was not fulfilled in the mid to late summer will actually be very strong in the fall. And if you look at what Southwest is doing, for example, where they're offering rate deals for September and October, to us that's a sign that others in the space believe that that's the case. The other thing I would tell you about recovery, inside terrorist attacks or health crises or recessions, trips recover faster than spending does. And you have to think about that. People will trade down on amenities. They will make more frequent trips at a lower cost versus that big long-haul trip that might cost more. We also know, as we've talked about, leisure travel will recover much more quickly than business travel. And there will be brands who traditionally rely on corporate or group travel that will pivot aggressively to leisure and try to fill demand that they would traditionally fill with group with leisure. And that's going to make a more competitive environment. The other thing I want to talk about is just hotel segments. And this goes back to trade down at amenities and the way, although trips will recover, spending will change. What we found in the data coming out of 08, 09, and in other cases, is that there's a bifurcation in the way in which people consume hotel rooms. The blue arrows here actually indicate the fact that the other lines that are hard to read tell you, which is people who still have wealth and who have wherewithal will trade up into a lower rate luxury environment. People who are challenged by the economy or who are in the middle market will typically trade down. So what you see happen is a bifurcation and move up to the higher end of the hotel market and a move down to the lower end. And that sometimes creates real challenges for the middle market of the hotel industry. And something to think about when you're thinking about revenue management or thinking about how to package your attraction or destination. The other thing that's very interesting is extended stay hotels are performing very well in this environment. And in fact, Misty Bells at Virtuoso, who's a DC native, talks about this, that there's this move to extended stay. We believe one of those conditions is what we're calling work from vacation, not WFH or work from home, but people who are actually going somewhere else, away from where they live and away from where they work, and they're setting up shop in a resort or destination, and they're bringing their families with them. We see a preponderance of data that tells us this is happening, and again, something to think about. There are countries like Bermuda. There are other destinations who are packaging, MGM Grand in Las Vegas, these work from our place packages where they are tipping in or leaning into this behavior. And we think it's really interesting. I also want to talk just a minute about meetings and this intent to go for a meeting or a business travel. We know that that's tipping down now dramatically in the last month. But I want to give you some hopeful news because Washington, D.C. is such an important destination for group and commercial travel. We know that meeting planners are still rebooking, have or will rebook for this year in a more recessed way. But we also know many of them, 8 in 10, are rebooking for 2021. So we do think there's hope on the horizon for group travel. Let me talk about a second insight in terms of how things may come back in traditional ways and how they may not. I don't think any of us believe that if you really like Dave Matthews, you're going to be happy watching him in your living room. You want to go to the show. I do think there's some technologies taking hold. Touchless service, whether it be digital menus through QSR codes, whether it be touchless check-in at hotels, some of the protocols that are being created in the cruise industry, in the rental car industry, I think those things are here to stay and probably will make our lives a lot easier in terms of travel. We also think that this idea of working from home has some merit, especially for organizations who need to sell online. And I think Destination DC is probably already working on virtual sales and the way in which we can be dynamic in a work environment in a virtual environment. We know that brands matter more than ever. Over 6 in 10 people prioritize their purchases based on their perception of brand, and in a troubling environment, people tend to lean on the brands they know best. So continuing to invest in what your brand is and marketing that brand is crucial in this environment. And even time-proven marketing techniques in digital environments, social environments, out-of-home environments will continue to be important. I think the way in which people are consuming content has changed. It was very news-heavy for a while. In this re-election environment, it's very news-heavy. But it will move back to more of these endemic types of content areas where people have traditionally looked for inspiration for travel and how they want to book their travel. Third insight, we think the winners coming out of recovery will be the ones that really adapt. I mentioned stretch season earlier. You should be thinking now about the travel that maybe you weren't able to convert or customers you weren't able to convert in the summer and how they are going to want to travel or partake in your product in the fall. And how can you lean into that behavior? The other thing I want to call out, and this is unfortunate, and I don't think this is talked enough about in the media, this recovery has been a tale of two different groups. The wealthy continue to get wealthier. The stock market is again at record highs. Those with wherewithal will continue to have wherewithal. But unfortunately, those who do not have economic wherewithal are suffering. Small business bankruptcies are up 27%. 1 in 3 people is seeking some kind of support for their own household. We know that people are struggling. Jobs are being lost. So I'm not trying to make a social statement here as much as say that for the travel industry, it is really important to understand there are people who are struggling, who are important to travel recovery that will not be traveling as quickly. And thinking about that and who will be traveling and specifically thinking about customer segments that have the wherewithal to travel is really important. We also have to remember that people are being asked to do more than ever. They're working from home. In many cases, they're educating their kids at home or they're having to take care of someone who they did not have to take care of before. They're being asked to do so much more around work and home and being pulled in multiple directions. And how we then communicate with people does have to have some sense of empathy, not only around safety, but around what people are doing in their lives and how much different their lives are. Just look at how much time people are spending with screens. It's over 10 hours a day now in terms of watching TV or being on some kind of device. And that's only growing. And people are going to continue to be using those types of environments for learning. And how we market to that is important. I also want to talk about resilient travelers. There's a group of travelers in the United States who, irrespective of travel advisories or concerns around any kind of crisis, will still travel. And identifying those people as early adopters for your own product is really important because they then affect and influence others to travel. And we call those resilient travelers. And I think it's important to think about those. And I mentioned earlier, people are going to travel by car. 72% of US travelers say they feel safest in their automobile. It's not actually true. It's actually more dangerous to drive than it is to fly today. But people feel like they're in control in their cars, and that is sort of a sign of how they want to travel overall. They want to be in control of their environments. It's why national parks and beaches and mountain resorts are doing so well in this environment, because there's are places where people can control who they're around and how they're interacting. I also think it's important to think about this longer-term trend, which is people are saying they want to visit new destinations. I think there's been a little bit of an ebb in that, but coming out of recovery, Washington, D.C. and our partners in the community have a chance to influence people who've maybe never been to D.C. before, or who've never been to a museum or a restaurant in the district. And they are now looking for new experiences coming out of recovery. And there's going to be a lot of demand for that going forward. We think there's a renaissance coming in advertising. In January of 2022, new privacy restrictions will go in place in the United States around cookie technology, which is going to change the way in which we use data. You look at this image about how much data every minute is shared around things like Instagram, Snapchat, LinkedIn, YouTube. People are consuming so much content in such rapid fire, and they're sharing back their data. The way in which we use that data for the next 12 months and into 24 months is going to have to change. So the way we think about converting, influencing travelers based on data is going to have to change too. So everybody should be thinking about privacy restrictions and the way in which you use cookies in any marketing you're doing. And then I want to talk about the customer journey, the traveler mindset, just for a moment. We believe that you start engaging people early in the process, months and months before they make decisions around inspiration and awareness, and then follow them through this journey where you're converting them over time. Well, now you must include a safety message. You must include an empathy message. You must change the way in which you're communicating along this cycle. We know that people want to travel. It's our job to make them feel safe about traveling and communicate with them the specifics of what that travel is going to be like. And that's really important as you think about marketing, public relations, social interactions, the way in which you create signage and customer service protocols in your own environment. Those things are going to be crucial coming out of recovery to be successful. We believe the OTAs are going to be more important in this recovery. For one thing, they spend a fortune. They'll still spend well over $5 billion in marketing. They have a credible share of voice. And we know in troubled times, consumers tend to look for aggregated influencers around travel. So we can expect Expedia Group and Booking Holdings to do very well in this environment, and maybe even better than they were doing previously. So thinking about your OTA partners, and not just Expedia and Booking, but others, and how you're interacting with them, Airbnb, for example, will be important. And then I think this is interesting. I mentioned a little bit earlier that people don't necessarily trust others to behave right in a coronavirus environment. We're definitely becoming more judgmental. I would call your attention to the 56% of people who expect to censor their social media around travel. I think there's this notion now of travel shaming going on. The New York Times wrote about this. People are traveling. There are communities that are very, very busy for leisure travel. But you would see a very dramatic reduction in the amount of social content that's being shared because people are a little bit worried that they're not behaving in the right way when they travel. So social influence, influencers, professional influencers, and just those who generate user-generated content are a little less likely to do so in this environment. And thinking about that from a social standpoint is really important. The last insight I want to share today is just about clean. I know I don't need to talk a lot about this, but there's two pieces of this. First, consumers overwhelmingly tell us, you must share with me your clean protocols. I want to understand how you're keeping my environment safe. But there's a very real cost. There's a financial cost to clean, and there's a sustainability or environmental cost to clean that we should all be thinking about. I think these are important data points as you think about those environments. But also the number of brands that are now doing partnerships, whether it's with organizations like the Mayo Clinic or Cleveland Clinic, or it's partnering with companies like Clorox or Lysol to do clean certification. You can do those on your own as well, communicating through brand strength that you are committed to safety and security for your guests and travelers. The other thing I would mention to those of you who play with travel insurance or are able to package travel insurance with your product, huge uptick in the number of people who want to buy or are buying travel insurance to protect their trips. And something that you can absolutely package to create some peace of mind for your guests. And then we look at it on an ongoing basis, what we call our travel safety barometer. These are the things, if you look at this chart, that people feel more safe doing versus really not feeling safe. And we see these things ticking up just ever so slightly, but as you might imagine, being outdoors, being in those kinds of environments outpaces being at a concert or being in a closed environment. And I think that will improve over time for everybody. But the other thing we have a lot of communities asking us is, what's the calculus for travelers on shared accommodations or short-term rental versus hotel stays? Where are travelers more confident? Interestingly, early on in the crisis, people said they were more confident in short-term accommodations, shared accommodations. But what's happened since is the hotel companies and hotels have begun to create much more stringent protocols around safety. So the calculus that the traveler's doing today is, I trust more an institution to clean my environment than I feel good about being in a short-term rental where I'm not around as many people. So as you think about your own situation, that's maybe important data to have. And then I want to end today with this idea that people are pivoting around their demand. Coming out of May and early June, we saw an uptick in intent to travel, a 7-point increase in 1 month for people that were going to get on the road in both air and car to travel. We then saw that tip down substantially at the end of July. My question now is where that's going to go for the rest of the year. As I said earlier, we believe demand is still absolutely there, mostly for leisure, but even for corporate travel. But the question will be, when do people feel safe doing that? And we do think for the leisure business, there's going to be some really strong demand for the fall that everybody in this meeting can think about trying to harvest and doing it in an empathetic and safe way. But over time, I think that we're going to see demand continue to build as we did in June as things get more under control. And here's some key action steps for you to consider. First, as I said already, pay attention to what travelers are saying around travel. I think a time for a hopeful message is probably passing. It's now time to be specific about inducements and things you can give people to incentivize them from traveling. building marketing programs, both in the short and long haul markets that invest over time in people's behavior. Pivot away from corporate travel and look at Smurf markets, leisure travel as a way to build bed base or build stays or visits to your attraction. Ensure that the DC brand is front and center. Washington, D.C. is a powerful brand. Destination DC has done a lot of work over the years investing in that brand, and I think as partners in the industry and in the community, you can lean into that brand and it can really benefit you. I mentioned earlier OTAs are going to be strengthening, so leaning into aggregators and influencers will be important. Any co-op programs that Destination DC or other partners you're involved with are offering, absolutely participate if you can. I think within your communication, I said this already, drive this perception of safety. Make sure that you're communicating the traveler's needs and a sense of empathy around, they have anxiety around travel when they travel. And then, as we always believe here at MMGY Global, you must invest in your brand. Even in the short term, brands are important. And for you to be able to invest in what you mean to your guest or your visitor is crucial all the time and continues to be really important because the strong brands coming out of this will steal share from the weak brands. So that was a lot. I really enjoyed the time today. I wish we could do Q&A, but if you have questions, feel free to send them to me on Twitter at Clayton Reid or on my email at creid@mmgyglobal.com. Again, thank you so much to Elliot and the team. We're really proud of our association with this group and appreciate the time today. Thanks.